Welcome to our session today. The title is Diversité musicale après la pandémie, or musical diversity after the pandemic. I'm Brandon Farnsworth, along with my colleagues Vanessa Macera and Anna Jakobsen. We'll be sort of hosting and initiating this session today. I want to, at the very beginning, thank also our host, SMCQ, for hosting this event, to Gabriel Couillard for helping us with the tech, and the Ministère des Relations Internationales de la Francophonie and the Nordic Council of Ministers for their financial support. Before we get into our discussion today, we also wanted to go over just quickly the schedule for this morning's session. So right now, as we're doing right now, we're going to have a sort of short welcome and introduction to this Taking the Temperature book project and symposium together with my two co-editors, Vanessa and Anna. And we're going to talk a little bit about the background and how we came to be discussing these topics together in this round with you today. And then about 20 minutes after that, we're going to start a discussion together with Terry Huron from Canada and Adele Kosman from Sweden about the different approaches to diversification and gender equality in Canada and the Nordic countries. After that discussion, we'll have a short break as of around 10:25, so we can all go get a coffee, have a bathroom break, all these kind of things. And then I will hand over my moderating duties to Sandeep Bhagwati, who's also joining us today, who will be chairing the second session. The second session takes place at 10:30 to 12, and we'll be focusing more specifically on Montreal's new music scene in the wake of COVID-19. That will be discussion, like I said, chaired by Sandeep Bhagwati, and in discussion will be Gabrielle Darmou, Miriam Boucher, and Barbara Scales. Once again, then, a word about how the two discussions today are going to work. So for those of you listening on YouTube, first of all, welcome. And second of all, feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat at any time. For those of you in our Zoom call, which are also the other panelists, if you'd like to say something during one of the sessions in which you're not active, feel free to raise your hand either on the Zoom function or sort of just, analog, and we'll unmute you and add your camera. The first session will be held in English in consideration for our Swedish colleagues, and the second session, you're free to choose what language you would like to use. Obviously, if you're asking a question either in the chat or you feel free to speak in French or English or Swedish. German is also fine, or I think Anna can probably figure out Norwegian or Danish if put on the spot. So without further ado, I'd like to sort of introduce the three of us who are staring at you through the screens this morning. My name is Brandon Farnsworth. I am an independent music curator based in Berlin, as well as a research associate at the Zurich University of the Arts in Switzerland at the Institute for Theory. In 2020, I completed my doctoral degree in historical musicology at the University of Music Carl Maria von Weber Dresden on the topic of curating contemporary music festivals, and I use the pronouns he, him. Anna Jakobsen, who's sitting next to me here virtually, is a Swedish creative producer and artist researcher. Her practice expands over the fields of contemporary music, opera, and theater, and is distinguished by an interest in feminine narratives and non-hierarchical working methods. She holds an MA in performance practice as research from the Royal Central School of Speech in London. And since 2017, she has worked as a creative producer for Konstmusiksystrar, English Sisters in Contemporary Music, a network of artists, producers, and educators working to increase the representation of women, transgender, and non-binary people in new music based in Stockholm. Hi, Anna. Vanessa Macera, also sitting next to me, is a sound artist and performer. She specialized in electroacoustic music, a medium she now uses as a means to express poetic ideas while being anchored in the many different spaces and cultural environments she's inspired by. Her works have been performed across North America and Europe, and in 2019, she received her PhD at the University of Sheffield with the practice-based research subject, Environment in Electroacoustic Music. So once again, before we go into our discussion, we wanted to sort of do a little bit of an introduction to the event and set the table sort of also conceptually for the ideas we're going to be tossing around in this informal discussion this morning. So this project began in November 2019, sort of through informal discussions that I had together with Vanessa and Anna at the Gender Relations in New Music conference in Zurich, which I organized. And Vanessa came to us with this idea of also connecting or perhaps setting up an international exchange with people from the Nordic countries and Quebec around these same sort of issues of gender and diversity. And this was obviously at a time where international exchange was to an extent, more taken for granted than it is right now in our current era of lockdowns and travel restrictions. But what we wanted to do back then was to connect with people who were diversifying the people and the practices involved in new music sort of across the entire ecosystem. So be they at conservatories, festivals, in ensembles, etc., in both these different contexts, and also sort of contrast, as we're going to do this morning, the different ways and strategies that have been that are being deployed in these different contexts in order to sort of explore and understand this variety of different approaches. We're also very much interested in sort of reflecting on a more deeper level about how these approaches were also changing, or at least had the potential to change new music practice itself. So we began this just before the lockdowns in March 2020, and obviously since then, as you all know, our performing arts ecosystem has been very radically transformed. But what I think is interesting about this entire project and these questions around diversity in the widest sense is that they seem to really have stayed with us and stayed sort of present in our conversations that have now moved onto Zoom and into sort of these onto these digital platforms that we're using now to debate what the performing arts will look like when they reopen again sometime in the future. And we think these are important for for many reasons, but perhaps two of the most important reasons for our editorial team have been the first, that this pandemic has actually created a kind of, we could call it a liminal moment almost, where these previously perhaps more radical or more sort of out there ideas seem to once again become more possible as we see symphony orchestras and operas really showing the signs of weakness and signs of not being this sort of all-encompassing, all-powerful institutions that we once thought they were. Obviously now being completely shut down and needing to also ask themselves the question of how things will change in the future. This also offers the opportunity for us to reshape for the better this performing arts ecosystem, and more specifically our musical networks and communities, in a way that we hope is better and more just than it was before. And the second reason that we think is very important is that we see how musical practitioners, already, at least many colleagues that I know, unfortunately, with minority backgrounds, are being disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And this also risks to undo many of the hard-earned gains that have been made in many diversity initiatives that have been going on over the past, perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 years. So these are all sort of very important issues that we need to really rally around, I think, as we sort of approach this moment where we as a community, or as communities interested in music, are going to think about and enact these reopenings and restartings of our musical ecosystem. And there I'd like to also then transition to Anna, who will take over explaining a little bit more of the background of this project.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Enchanté. My name is Anna Jakobsson, and I'm a creator and researcher of performing arts based in Stockholm. I have been working as a producer for Colloque Sisters in Contemporary Music since 2017, and it's a network that works to increase the representation of women, transgender, and non-binary people working in contemporary music in Sweden. And as Brendan mentioned, this project started sort of at the Greenham conference that I took part of in 2019 together with my colleague Kajsa Antonsson. And the Conference Existra is one of the partner association of this project, which is an exchange project between Quebec and the Nordic countries. And the original plan was to do 2 symposiums, one in Oslo and one in Montreal. And in connection to this, we would also have 2 residencies, where one scholar from Quebec would go to the Nordic countries and vice versa. But because of the ongoing pandemic, naturally these plans got cancelled, or first postponed and then cancelled, to say. And instead, we decided to do a publication instead, where we have done like in-depth interviews with stakeholders in the contemporary music scene. And the first publication was launched at the Ultima Contemporary Music Festival in Oslo in September last year. And it contained 25 interviews with practitioners and researchers in new music. And most of them were, or many of them were connected to the Oslo music scene where Ultima takes place. The book, Taking the Temperature, Crisis, Curating in Musical Diversity, is divided into 3 sections: festivals, networks, and institutions. So it's quite a broad scoop. And today we are really happy to launch the 2nd edition, to which we have added 5 more interviews and also done a few follow-ups with people that we interviewed the last time. And this is also, it's been published part of the OnQ rating platform, which is a Zurich online platform. And so, and for the 2nd edition, we have also made an effort to include more voices from the Quebec scene. And some of you are here today and will be part of the panel later, which we are really happy about. And perhaps now I leave over to Vanessa, who can say a few more words about our discoveries or findings that we have made in this as part of this work.
Yes, thank you. So since 2020, of course, with the new COVID context, a lot of questions have risen around how do we keep new music relevant and thriving, since most of our traditional platforms have been more or less overnight completely shut down or had to be reinvented very, very quickly with the online technologies and having to be all at a distance. So what did that mean? A lot of our interviewees questioned, how do we go forward? And a lot of it, we're still with questions now. So a lot of the answers are still being sought after right now. But we already have some ideas for reflection. For instance, we have Adel Koosman, who was saying that our audience needs commitment, like better commitment and engagement, and to embrace the digital format so that from the beginning of the creative process, so that contemporary music can still be relevant and thrive. We have also, for instance, Alain Mongeau from Mutec, who took this opportunity as an occasion to go back to the roots of the original Mutec as it started in the first years, where it was a completely digital native digital cultural event. And with this, even if in the previous most recent years, the events have been more local and physical, in 2020, they managed to have a hybrid event with a mix of live and streaming and pre-recording, but this also had presented its lot of difficulties, because there was a learning curve with all the technical adaptations, with setting up things such as multi-camera recordings of the performance and streaming setups, which this is an ongoing issue in the live music scene right now with the new context. And also at the institutional level, there are questions of having, so who is in charge and how is the change being brought about? So questions that, for instance, Gabriel Damou has explored a lot in the interviews. And so for him, it is very much up to individuals in leadership roles to do the work, to do a lot of the work. And there's a huge amount of resistance to meaningful change. So a lot of institutions with deep roots in coloniality should, revisit their position in this actual space right now to be able to welcome new diversity initiatives. But as Mutek says, in the future, for the foreseeable future, and the next event will probably be a lot like the hybrid concert events and mostly digital as well, because of the new context. So we are still left with a lot of questions and a lot of things to explore. So hopefully in these discussions, we'll be able to dive deeper in this today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so too. Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks, Anna, too. Just before we get started, just as a reminder, if you are interested in our updated and expanded Taking the Temperature publication, it's available now via oncurating.org in the book section. I think it hasn't been updated to the main page yet, but it's available as an open access PDF, so you can also spread it in your networks, and also as a print-on-demand publication. So if you would like a hard copy, you're able to order that as well. It's quite nice. So yeah, we'd be very appreciative if you checked it out. So now it's time to bring in our two additional panelists, Terry Hran and Adele Cosman. I'll just read your bios and then we can get into our discussion. So Terry Hran is a musician, performer, and multimedia artist. Her work explores historical instrumental performance practice and repertoire, field recording, ceramics, movement, and video. Terry studied musicology and art history at the University of Alberta, historical and contemporary performance at the Conservatorium for Notre-Dame, and electroacoustic composition at the Université de Montréal. Her research focus on collaborative practices and scoring in multimedia. Her research focuses on collaborative practice and scoring in multimedia performance art. She was a visiting scholar at Wesleyan University before taking her current position as executive director of the Canadian New Music Network, where she has developed programs focused on equity and access. Welcome, Terry. Our second panelist, Adele Cosman. So A.M. Cosman, or Adele Marcia Cosman, is an electroacoustic composer, performer, and vocalist. They explore sound and space mainly through field recordings, synthesis, algorithmic composition, and vocals, along with careful audio editing. Their latest pieces embrace concepts of emotional relationships to time, chopping, and glitch, as well as formlessness and intense turbulence. They've been a board member of Kunstmusik Sistra since 2019. Welcome, Adele. So just to get into our discussion, we've heard now from the voices in this chat are quite sort of mainly based in Sweden. So in order to sort of weigh out our discussion, we would like to maybe start with you, Terry. If you could maybe sort of say for us a little bit what kind of diversity initiatives are happening in music in Canada at the moment from your perspective.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation. I live and work, and CNMN's main offices are in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and which is on unceded Indigenous lands and waters, and whose recognized custodians are the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. CNMN, the Canadian New Music Network, also has membership across Turtle Island, and therefore is also covering many territories and is representing many different kinds of people. And so it's very difficult to answer the question of what is happening across Canada in new music in terms of diversity. I think that we are at a special moment and have been for a long time, or not for a long time, but definitely since the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have come out, and we've all been called to action, and that has had its resonance or not with different institutions. But I think it's a call that can't be ignored anymore. And many of us are trying to figure out ways in which we can respond with integrity and in ways that are profoundly questioning how we make music, what we consider music, and who we want to hear music being made from and participate in. There are so many initiatives that are happening in terms of diversity in Canada at the moment. I would say that at the Canadian New Music Network, so much of our activities are focused around this, and either diversity in terms of culture, ethnicity, gender, but also pluralism more largely in terms of access, accessibility, and age, so many things that we were perhaps setting to the side of the table rather than placing at the center, because there were already so many people, and people talked regularly about the scene being full, but the scene is full of a certain kind of music and of a certain kind of people. And so now we are in a new place where suddenly everybody's been pulled out of the stages and out of the concert halls, and we are in a position to rethink what might happen afterwards. So that's really incredible, I think, as an opportunity. I find it very difficult to name different initiatives that are happening in Canada because there are so many of them, and there are so many presenters who are making an effort, great efforts to make new kinds of decisions in programming. And that's not just in the ways that, in the people that you might see on your screens at the moment during performances, or in your ears in podcasts. It's also about how they're making those decisions about who is going to be on the scenes and who is making those decisions and how they're making those decisions. And I think those things are changing a lot. I think that on the national level, we do have some national institutions and arts service organizations, and they are sometimes seem to be slow to move, slow to change, and that's that can be very frustrating for sure. But I do think that it's moving in the right direction, thanks to the great efforts of a lot of people pushing, and a lot of people who have been doing this work for a very long time. And there are some wonderful initiatives coming out of that. A lot of mentorship programs on the national level, on the regional level also. And these mentorship programs are starting to be wider in scope, not just for performers or composers, but blurring those lines, which I think is a good initiative as well, because those divisions are possibly also very centered on one type of practice. And there are also all of the national organizations now finally have equity and diversity inclusion committees, which they didn't until recently. So this is all a big change. And of course there are individuals and presenters and companies that are doing great work, but I'm not sure if it's very fair to name some and to forget others, because I certainly don't know about all of them. And what I do know is that I am constantly heartened by seeing wonderful new programming, and especially that programming is now centering and focusing also often on including Indigenous artists, Indigenous ways of knowing and of presenting. And I think that is just going to be such a wonderful way to be inspired towards resilience in our move out of, possibly, maybe out of our pandemic reality.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I think at this point I would like to turn it actually over to you, Adele. You're living in a very different context to Canada, and obviously in a situation that's also quite different in terms of the relationship to lockdowns and restrictions, though also in Sweden, obviously the stages are also closed. How do you sort of see the situation from your perspective?
The situation of the pandemic, you mean?
Yeah, and its relationship to diversity initiatives, also to your work with Konstmusiksystrar.
Well, in regards to Konstmusiksystrar, we haven't seen a huge change, I would say. Of course, we are not able to meet as it is now, but the core work that we've been doing over the years have mainly been online, the conversations among the board and stuff like that. So in regards to Konstmusiksystrar, I would say that we are quite intact, especially in comparison to other larger institutions that are basically only has been doing just live performances and everything that requires an audience to be on spot and stuff like that. So I think we are also being such a small network, we're kind of easily adaptable. So the projects that have been ongoing, we've managed to kind of shift into a digital format very swiftly. And also I would say that being mainly of a younger generation, we also kind of have that knowledge and perhaps also experience to just take it from an online format.
Yeah. Did you want?
Go for it.
All right, great. So I have this is a very interesting position or perspective for me, because I have experience of both contexts. I've been in Sweden and in Quebec, and I'm part of both Konstmusiksystrar and FEM, which is Femmes en Musique. And I've seen very huge similarities, whereas the communications are really a lot online, except that Konstmusiksystrar is very much organized in the fact that it has a board and it has, monthly meetings at the least, at least monthly meetings, where FEM is just it's more like a movement where the discussion is always ongoing and it goes through social media mostly. So it's very interesting to see the parallels between the two, and also how we really quite work quite differently as well, but we've been getting results on both ends as well. So with FEM, there's a big sense of community and people helping each other daily, or giving each other tips, for instance, and it's much more viewed as a community, because there's no one really at the helm of the movement. And then with Konstmusiksystrar, it's very also interesting to see all the initiatives and the projects and the workshop ideas and really, really great projects being led by this group, which also gives them bigger outreach and a good position in Europe for this in new music, and for the promotion of diversity in new music. So that's actually really, really gives me a lot of hope on both sides, actually, to see where Konstmusiksystrar can bring new music, and how FEM can actually support independent artists with the strength of the network.
Yes, I can also add a little bit about the Swedish or Scandinavian perspective when it comes to diversity. I interviewed Terry for the publication, and I was kind of struck also by this sort of advanced or in-depth knowledge or focus on indigenous people situation and colonization. I mean, we have those issues in Sweden as well, the Sápmi people, etc. But in terms of the diversity discussion in new music, I would say it's not so present. So in Sweden, there has been a lot of focus on gender equality the last 15 years or so, I would say. And this has to do with a lot of things, but one of the main basis for this development is a decision by the government in 2007, where they decided that all the institutions, organizations that receive state funding needs to strive for a 50-50 representation when it comes to gender in their programming. So if you think about these big orchestras or concert halls, they had a lot of work to do in this area, which created this sort of big crave or demand for organizations at Skåpes systrar. There is also another organization called KVAST, Swedish Association of Women Composers, and it was founded in 2008. And they have really done a great and big work when it comes to changing the repertoires within the orchestra institutions. They have made statistics based on all the big concert halls, music institutions repertoire, and also had meetings and worked like with lobbyists, that kind of stuff, to really bring this question to the table. So today, when it comes to newly written music, it is quite equal, or at least they really, or I would say there is a really big awareness. But then if you look at like the old repertoire, like the older repertoire, of course, this is not the case. So I would say it's pretty advanced, like the diversity work in Sweden, or like when it comes to awareness, and that it is on the agenda and spoken about. But when it comes to like people of color, indigenous people, age, disability, I would say the discussion is not really, or there are not so many voices raising those topics, and that is true both for like big institutions, but also for the independent music scene, I would say. So yeah, it's very, very white. Do you want to add anything, Adele, from what I said?
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to agree with you, and also that would also be the same for Konstmusiksystrar, where we up until now have focused on, well, in regards to representation, it has been within gender. And then also kind of going into details, we would also, of course, like oppose, like questioning seriosity and like the genius stereotypes and stuff like that. But that would be more into a detailed situation. So Sweden in general, and perhaps all of the Nordic countries would do good in kind of expanding their work in equality through beyond only the gender issue.
We have a question from Barbara Scales, where I don't know if you want to actually ask it live.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can integrate it into, also, I think Terry wants to respond, but I would kind of wrap it all together, in that it sort of seems like the situation in Sweden and the Nordic countries is maybe very specifically related to this issue of gender diversity, which is sort of quite a concrete, well, a very specific issue, and that you can also measure it in terms of numbers and, you know, these sort of calls for 50-50 gender representation. But Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, but the situation you seem to be addressing is maybe one that's more intersectional, which makes it a little bit slipperier perhaps, or how do you see it?
Well, definitely gender is incredibly important in the new music field, and I think all of us who work in it have had our moments of great frustration about that. But I think when we're talking about diversity or pluralism, we need to think beyond just gender. And especially here in Canada, which I think is a different situation than in Europe, because when we talk about new music, so many people don't even consider the definition of what that might be. And I think a lot of times their definition of that is something very Eurocentric, or music coming from that tradition. And we are not in Europe. We are mostly on unceded Indigenous territories. And so if we want to really be accurate, we should definitely say this is a new Eurological or Eurocentric music. And if we want to redefine new music, then we have to be very conscious about that and really start to question ourselves from the inside about what we consider music to be and how we want to present it, and what is in our repertoire as musicians, or and those kinds of things. Sometimes I think perhaps as creators we might think, oh well, this is just coming from me, but we have conservatories and music education systems that still teach the basics of Western music and are only slowly transitioning to a much wider type of pedagogy with different values, and talking about questions of genius, or that brings up the question of merit, and how do we choose things? How do we consider things good or worthy? And so then comes the whole discussion around gatekeeping, and even in Canada, our system, it revolves so much around granting and subsidizing creation through government and public funds. And so the gatekeeping on that is very important, but even also the forms and the ways in which we apply for that money. All of that stuff is really important to think about very consciously and and rethink, I think, in terms of how it might better reflect a much wider group of people. And that wider group of people is living in our country, not to mention that we live as settlers on this land.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And I just see there's the question in a chat here from Barbara regarding sort of these different musical epistemes in the Nordic countries. Barbara, would you like to ask that question?
Yeah, hi.
Or I can also read it for you. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go for it.
Okay.
So we want to hear your voice.
I had two questions. Can you hear me? Yeah, I had two questions that came up in the course of these really interesting presentations. And one is about the inclusion in the music scene in Sweden or in Scandinavia that recognizes and embraces the influx of people from the Middle East, particularly refugees in the past decade or two, perhaps. And And the other question had to do with the binary. Should I ask one at a time? I think they're both interesting questions.
Perhaps maybe one at a time, yeah.
Yeah, okay. One at a time. So there you go. That's the first question.
Yeah, Kunstmusikhistorie people, how do you see this issue? I also could say something to that as well, but you go for it first.
Yeah, I couldn't say that I can remember any specific initiative embracing Middle Eastern culture within new music in Sweden. But I would say that in terms of representation and like making a mark on the national culture, I would say that popular music would have a much larger like inclusivity, but where like the Middle Eastern heritage within Sweden, which is quite large, has a bigger imprint. And unfortunately, I can't really see that in the new music scene.
Yeah. Thank you.
I mean, like what comes to mind from my perspective would be just to answer also maybe from another perspective would be there's definitely been an interest maybe particularly in Norway, I know of projects that are dealing with including these voices and recognizing that that there are people with different musical traditions who have moved here and who want to also have them represented on stage. I believe there was a project 2 years ago at Ultima Festival relating to having people also process their stories of coming over, the journey over from the Middle East to here, and I believe also in a couple other contexts. I don't want to name them because they're not on the tip of my tongue. But you also had another question about this binary definition of composers and performers. If you go for it.
Yeah. Well, what I wrote is: are there issues in the binary concerning the binary definition of performers and composers? Is there concern about grappling with the recognition of the non-binary character of society? And just to say that I've had pushback, for instance, from a French string quartet, which was asked to present a concert of women composers, something that they've done for many years now. And they were concerned about having a program currently of women composers because of the binary definition of these composers. And I just wondered if there's reflection on that or discussion and how that affects programming, particularly of women composers or demands for 50-50 representation. Thank you.
Do any of you want to take that from Kunstmusikhistorie, or because I think it goes back to, I'm not sure if this is maybe part of the core that we're touching on here of this entire thing. That let's see if I can connect these dots here. But I think I would say that definitely the more experimental music scene in the Nordic countries and in Europe is a little bit disconnected from is maybe has a different outlook or aesthetic outlook maybe than some of the more traditional new music, or how would I say this? It's a very difficult topic to explain because I think we're really getting to the core here of differences in between these two scenes. Whereas I find in the Canadian context, perhaps there's more still an established system of perhaps ensembles playing pieces. Whereas I think in Europe, and this goes back maybe also to your issue, Terry, that there are sort of quite a long tail of different kinds of practices that are dealing with the traditions of music in different ways. And so I don't think it's surprising that a quartet like that would have that kind of opinion, but you would definitely be able to find other kinds of groups that have a very kind of different approach to these issues. And it also relates to sort of in what particular context are you insisting on a 50-50 gender representation? Is it in a context where that is really a quota that is there for a reason because we have had so many instances of all male concerts that are just simply unacceptable anymore, and where it's sort of really trying to again push back against that that sort of system that's clearly in some way broken and not reproducing it, and also reproducing itself, or is something else going on? Would anyone else like to respond?
Well, I can respond with my experience of having been part of the organization of UNM, which is Young Nordic Music, which is a group of, it's different. It's in the new music area, obviously, but it's also all 5 different Nordic countries. So it's Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland coming together to organize every year a festival of selected pieces by composers, and then we also collaborate with local performers as well. But so the way that the pieces are selected in the process, there is an anonymous jury, and also there is not anonymous, but there is a quota, which, so when they actually deliberate on the pieces, they, even if they don't know the composers, if they end up with, more than 50% of male composers in the selection, then they have to go back and get the next female composer, or a piece by a female composer. But at the same time, it has happened on some occasions where the reverse has happened, where they had because there's a rule where it's you can't have 2 years in a row more than 50% of either of the genders, and the way that it's been received was actually really kind of seamless. I mean, the groups all see it as very a sound strategy to have, and it's not been problematic, and it's actually solved a lot of problems by achieving this sort of equity over the years, actually. Yeah, and I can speak for, this is this is called Young Nordic Music, so this is very it's the new generation. I've also had experience with the Nordic Music Days, which has a different, it's a very similar organization where there's also the 5 same Nordic countries coming together, but they haven't been always applying the same quota. It depends on the festival director at the same time.
Right. Terry, I see you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to respond as well?
Yeah, I think that in Canada, the situation is again more troubled. At least, I mean, I'm not in Northern Europe, but of course, these equity questions are very important. And from my experience running juries and being on juries, it's a very important issue, as are regional representation and other diversity questions. But to go back, I think, to your question of this, the binary nature of the composer and the performer, which I think is an interesting also point of departure for thought. I think that is something, again, that has been brought to us from European ways of thinking about music. And in Canada, for sure, there are more and more people who refuse to identify as one or the other, and that has given a lot of courage to many performers to create music, and also to many composers to perform music, which is wonderful. And I think it's reflected also in the new funding model, not so new anymore, but our recent change in the national funding model at the Canada Council for the Arts, which has categories which do not make these distinctions anymore. And I think when we're talking about pluralism or diversity, these are really important things to start removing from the vocabulary, because they are really centered on one practice from a certain area. And so and they really expand our idea of what creativity and creative agency could be.
Wonderful. Anna, you wanted to respond?
Yeah, no, just regards to what you were saying about the non-binary, can also relate to what Terry says. And I think that we are at a point now where we kind of maybe don't want to talk so much about like men, women, or more, and we sort of wish for a a broader prisma or broader scope of, and perhaps, and also like to shift the focus. I did a talk in Denmark at the conservatorium there, and then there was a guy in the audience, and he was after we had done our lecture, his first question was like, okay, but aren't you isn't it like hard for you to be here only because you are women, like or isn't it frustrating to just be like, to have been chosen to do this because you are women? And I think it's yeah, so I think there is like inner struggle as well, because I don't think that anyone wants to be defined just because of their gender. It's so I think in Conspecific Systra we have sort of tried to shift the discussion as well, talking more about working conditions for composers and how to sort of challenge this strict hierarchical ideals, which come from this like Eurocentric view of what is classical music, what is new music, and also the image of the composer as the male genius. So I think we are really working with different aspects of that, trying also to make it fun and playful. Do you want to add anything, Adele, to what I said now?
Yeah, I'm agreeing with you again, because when I heard this question from Barbara, I immediately thought about the playfulness that Conspecific Systra work with a lot, and that all of our projects are very different, and call for works are always, yeah, we would never specify titles in such a way that we would look for composers, or we kind of try to have that open, maybe call it artists, putting it broadly. And I would also agree with you that this is a very important question. Also myself being a vocalist, like entering music through being a vocalist, because that was kind of the role that was accessible for me, being young and interested in music. And so having that separating composers and performers would, at least in my understanding, create a huge barrier for a lot of non-male musical performers and composers. So it's a very interesting aspect. And I do say, yeah, I really do think that Conspecific Systra are doing a very good job in neglecting that binary and being very open to all sorts of musical practices.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder to what extent it's also a generational question. I think we've seen that a couple of times come up in this conversation, that it seems that the younger generations, the ones who are sort of, coming up now in the field, and also maybe whose careers have been the most impacted by COVID as well, are the ones who are more willing to mix these different categories together with a little bit more abandon, and to sort of move away from these binary definitions, and perhaps also Eurocentric forms of artistic production, or sort of formats that imply certain Eurocentric logics, these sort of things. I am looking at the time and see that we are almost out of time for this discussion. Does anyone want to have a final word of our panelists, or would you like to take a break before our final session? Not any last words. any final comments?
I'd just like to mention, and I don't like the idea that it's a final comment, but I know that one of the things that has happened during this pandemic is that the use of social media and online performances, but also knowledge sharing has become much more important. And I noticed that a lot of the art service organizations here in Canada have really upped their game when it comes to knowledge sharing, and just giving a lot of more guidelines and a lot more ideas about how to improve our situation, and even just to sensitize people to some of these issues that perhaps in their practice they've never had to think about. And I see that as being incredibly positive and nourishing our national and international conversation about how to move forward in a more equitable and fairer way. So I see that there's definitely positive things that are coming out of all of this.
I'm on mute, which I almost didn't see. Great, I think we should probably end it there. So thank you very much to Terry and Adele for your comments, and also to Barbara for your questions. That was really great. So clap emojis in the chat, everybody. Exactly. And so now we'll have a short break so you can grab a coffee or something like this, and we will be back together at in about 5 or 6 minutes with the second panel. So thank you very much, everybody, and stay with us. We're back in about 5 or 6 minutes. Ciao.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to whoever watches. It's a characteristic of our time that everybody's in different time zone, and that's true for this panel too. It's at least 2 time zones in Europe and in Canada, in Quebec. This is the second panel of the conference on, or the meeting workshop on musical diversity after the pandemic. And I welcome 3 colleagues who are with me in this discussion, plus the discutants from the previous discussion, from the previous panel, who will be also able to join the discussion if they want to, and they will appear on the screen if they want to. So my colleagues are Barbara Scales, a good friend. Hello, Barbara. Who is the director of Latitude 45 Arts Promotion Agency, or whatever that entity is, in Montreal since 1981. So she works with performing artists at a very high level and travels internationally all the time. It's very hard to know where she is at any given time, at least before the pandemic. And works with artists from different countries, placing them in concerts, but she's also very active as an administrator and doing service to the community. She has a very interesting master's thesis title that I like in her bio. What does it mean to say that art belongs to its time? And that's exactly one of the questions that we have in this. So you're an expert on that. She's on the board of directors of the Canadian Music Centres in Quebec. She's served on different other boards around the world, and is also with me a founding editor of the journal Turba, the Journal for Global Practices in Life Arts Curation. Hello, Barbara.
Hello, Sandeep. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Now the next guest is Myriam Boucher. Myriam is a video and sound artist based in Montreal. And her work highlights intimate dialogues between music and sound and image. And her performances are mostly visual or audiovisual, include VJing and often immersive. So she likes to engage with nature, with landscapes, the relationship that humans have with nature. And her composition range from works to orchestra, ensemble, to collaborative and audiovisual pieces, solo audiovisual pieces, featuring all kinds of DJing and VJ techniques, which she often notates fully and integrates into this concert music setting. She has also participated in numerous juries and has been a member of the Canadian Electroacoustics Community's Board of Directors and of the Canadian Codex, a concert organization in Montreal. She has also conducted or directed the first video music festival in Montreal in 2015 and is a professor at Université de Montréal. And finally, hi, Myriam. Hi.
Hi.
And finally, Gabriel Damu is a composer, vocalist, improviser, researcher. He studied at Université Laval with Eric Morin, and then the Conservatoire in Montreal. And his work includes many instrumental and vocal genres and traditions, and has been performed all over the world. He has received many awards for his commissions, compositions, and is one of the most diverse voices in the many sense of this word in the Canadian and international scene today as a vocalist. And that's the blurring of lines between composer and performer, and in his work too. And as an interdisciplinary artist, principally his work Anthropologie Imaginaire has been shown around the globe, and it's a wonderfully serious and a funny exploration of music and the stereotypes that are used to describe it. He also leads the vocal ensemble and explores queer arts and drag artistry as Bijuria. He's also a PhD artist at Concordia University. Full disclosure, I'm his supervisor, but he's free to say anything that he wants. obviously. My name is Sandeep Bhagwati. I'm a composer, researcher, and poet, theater maker, ensemble leader, with an international career. Right now I'm in Zurich, but I'm a director of martial art at Concordia University, who is also a co-host of this whole event in the Grande Nuit and the two colloques. Okay, so I will start with a little introduction to the thematic from my point of view, and then hand over to questions from all of you. So for me, it's clear the pandemic has changed all our lives. It's a year now, and musical life has changed in many ways. And a lot has been said about the personal impact on musicians, the impact on organizations, the way the inspiration and the resilience of all these people has been tested, and maybe some more instances will come out today. What struck me, especially when we talk about blurring the lines between the composer and the performer, that this old distinction actually has been changed profoundly by the pandemic. We could call it a composerification of the performers' lives, because suddenly they're forced to live and work like previously only composers had to live and work, working alone at home in isolation from the audience, preparing materials for a distribution they can't control without having a live relationship to the audience, never seeing their listeners, constantly having to think of new ways to do their work, getting no or very little money from this work itself, but getting handouts in general. So all this is very familiar to composers in the old structure of things. And these handouts usually are not related to the quality or the frequency of your work. So all of that is very familiar to the old model of the composer, and it has become a model for performers too. This has created a lot of anxiety, and it's also something that might be explored in our conversation. On a larger scale, also one thought that crossed my mind is that we've been forced to understand how our economic system, but also not only our economic system, but also our cultural system and our aesthetic predilections have been built on techniques of expansion, extraction, acquisition, and appropriation. So a new music festival is what Dylan Robinson, the scholar for indigenous arts, has called hungry music, meaning that we always want more material, more extended techniques, more technology, more new things, more newness. And so there is kind of a hunger there that is evident in the new music scene, which is closely related to another hunger that our society has for raw materials in general. And even before the pandemic, the cultural scene, and music is always a little late, but it always already started to think about the impact of these centuries of expansionist and extractionist hungry culture in the economically developed countries of the North, which is the countries that are tuned into this conversation today. So how has the pandemic infected these thoughts? Have the ideas changed? Or did we only change our methods, but kept the old ideas of, expansion, more techniques, and so on, so on? Have the realities, and we heard a little bit about this in the first panel, have the realities of women and relevant minorities in the context of these art forms changed over this pandemic year in any significant way? Have they gotten better or worse? Have curators changed their opinion about curating in different, more diverse ways? We heard that the pandemic has affected marginalized and minority and emerging artists more than it has established artists. Do they still want to go into this scene after this experience? Is there still a sense that this musical scene is something for them? I know that many musicians have said, no, I'm not going to do music after all as my life work. I'm going to do some other job. And how have presenters reacted? That's principally something for Barbara also. Do they see that the diversity of practices, of people, and of aesthetics that previously was kind of, separated into nice streams, can now impact them in a more general way, and have they changed their policies? So these are some of the questions that went to my head, and maybe that we could address in the panel. So my first question, a concrete question here, is, so we take it as a given that the pandemic has changed your life. How has it changed your relationship to music and music making? Especially as we see that some practices that were very high in demand before the pandemic, like immersive technologies, music in space, using different settings, locations, and so on, is not really possible in this context, in the context that we're living in anymore. So has the practice become more diverse as a result of the pandemic? Has it closed down? Does the virtual musical life that we all lead offer really exciting creative possibilities to musicians and to presenters? Or do you still feel that it's only a supplement or a bad replacement, or that's a thing for the real thing, namely the live event and the concert? I don't know who wants to ask that question, answer that question first.
I'd love to address it, but I'd love to hear what Gabriel has to say as a performer. I think that would be great to know what he has to say.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I've not kept the pulse on what every institution, every organization is doing. I'm not interested in doing that. I think they're obviously good questions to ask, but I'm gonna maybe speak more from a practitioner's perspective. I've found my level of care has shifted. So I care deeply about things, and I have stopped caring about other things. And I've not been really, I've been disengaging a little bit with the traditional kind of contemporary music ways of doing and the institutions a little bit, because I've not found them to be in resonance with what's happening and my experience of how I'm living it, but also how I see marginalized people living it. So not just myself, but like other people. So I find that I've been engaging more and more with my drag persona, because it's very online. It's very it was easy to stay creative in that field, and to feel like you're actually putting things out there that people are looking at or engaging with is important. So I don't know. So I have many thoughts, but there's definitely like a sense of disconnecting and of, because I'm a person of color in the scene, but I'm still an insider. I'm still someone that has gone through the whole training and has played the game in the rules that are supposed to, the commissions, the grants, the competitions, and all that. So I've done that, but now I also feel like I want to be more. I'm less tolerant. I'm less keen on playing different games at the same time, and I'm more keen to just do the other things that I feel are more rewarding, but not rewarding so much in a financial way, but in a way that everything sort of makes more sense between what I want to do as an artist and how I feel as a human in this world and in this political climate and with everything happening. So yeah, I'll stop it there because I have other thoughts, but they might fit with other questions later.
Yeah, just a little follow-up there. Is there a sense of, there's a sense of something having improved in how you're talking about it. Did I hear that right, or is that a generalization?
Improved from what perspective?
For yourself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would say that I'm feeling like je suis plus conséquent entre mes principes ou puis la manière dont je vais mettre mon art au monde. There's always contradictions also. I'm more interested in following that instinct than the instinct of like prestige and recognition and acceptance of a scene that I'm not seeing do the best, honestly, or that in this situation.
Thank you. Barbara, you had...
Yeah, I would love to talk about this a bit. I mean, there's so much else to discuss on our agenda today, but let me just say that on March 15th, I had a conversation with Isaac Goldschneider from Innovation en Concert, and the conversation, it was a Sunday, and the conversation went something like this: what the are we going to do? Looks like everything is closed down. Well, it'll only be a few months. So on Monday, I called a few people and I learned how to use Zoom, and we had our first Midi Musique Quebec presenters, mostly musicians, ensemble leaders. And it was all about how do we survive? This is canceled, that's canceled, everything's going to be canceled. And then there was also the question of the digital pivot, and what do we do about that? And how do we not make stuff that nobody would ever really want to see if they weren't in a panic state, filming with our iPhones in our kitchens to make performances for the National Arts Center, which was a wonderful way to get people to survive for a while. 700 performers given the opportunity to have $1,000 in their pockets and do a performance literally from their kitchens. But we kept chatting daily until mid-July, at which point I decided to ask for a grant to look at digital literacy, basic ABCs for everybody in the milieu, from how do you produce something to how do you present it, how do you negotiate a contract for it, what's the best strategy for making a work available or not available in an exclusive or behind a paywall, or I mean, these were all huge questions which were just baffling us, but they were also baffling presenters. I was doing stuff with major institutions who had no idea. I mean, they were still talking about exclusivity in a 50-kilometer radius in their contracts, which had nothing to do with making something for web diffusion or for web distribution. So it was, it was a huge learning curve. But I want to say, I think for many people, I mean, it was a disaster for many, many people, loss of income, and the blessed Canadian government in some regards did help to keep people alive, put food on the table. Despite people falling through the cracks in some cases, there was a real effort to make it viable for people. But what did happen that I've been seeing to some degree is people stepping back, deciding to take a breather instead of being instead of satisfying that appetite that you referred to, Sandeep, for hunger, that hunger to have more of this and more of that, and just blow yourself up so that you can be something something for everybody. People really stepped back, and I think what Gabrielle suggested is really is emblematic of what some people were doing. That is, taking what it was that they really wanted to do, finding a way to do it, stating that they wanted to do it, and if it required more funding, looking for the funding, taking the risk, going ahead with some things, and really developing things that they never had the time to do before. Artists and art has a sustainability issue. And when you put people on the road and say, okay, you're on a tour, you've got 35 performances in 40 days, hop to it, and this is your itinerary, and oh, you need that kind of hotel. Oh, no smoking in the rooms. Okay. I mean, these things are in some ways a huge distraction from the work of art. And it's also not a very healthy way for audiences to get to know artists. So the idea of the artist as a fragile resource, as a limited resource, is barely respected in the pre-pandemic model of performing and touring. And I'm hoping, we can talk perhaps more about this later, but I'm hoping that we can really try to develop a way of presenting art and artists which is more sustainable for the artist, more sustainable for the planet, so that we're not putting artists on planes every other day, and creating sort of regional residencies, and also using some of these wonderful skills that we're developing of the digital pivot, creating things that can enhance the understanding of the art and the artist by having recorded material and interviews, whether performances or interviews or storytelling or pedagogical things. Go ahead, Sandeep, sorry.
No, I'm just saying that you're almost have the word for the end of our panel.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
But we can revisit this vision that you have later. Thank you for that. Miriam, did you experience in your practice, did you experience the same stepping back and reorienting? Or what was your experience immediately and after a year? Has there been any development there?
Mm-hmm. Yes, can I say it in French? Because it will be easier for me because it's a lot of things. But at the beginning in March, I was supposed to stay in France and in Europe, and everything crashed. Like everything was like, oh, what we will do with everything is closed, and so the first months, like March, April, and until the summer, it was really a big break, like what we can do with this situation. And for me, it was really like a big respiration too, because I was traveling a lot since years. And it was like, oh, it feels so good to stay here in Montreal and to reconnect with my friends and my family, because everybody was, oh, how are you? Are you okay? And it was for me really, it was a new thing in my life, you know, to call my parents every day, and and so the question after that, it was like, why I'm doing art, you know, why? Because I was a little bit disconnected, because like you said, Barbara, with all the travels and the booking and the contracts and all the things around our work, also you don't ask yourself this question, why I am doing it. So a lot of people, I saw a lot of people in my milieu to ask themselves this question, and some of them just decided to stop doing music and to move to another region in Quebec, or so it's sad, but it's their thing. And for me and for other people, it was like, we want to do art, so let's do it. And a lot of creative initiations happened, and beautiful things, a lot of more a bigger conscience about our little world here, and it's fragile. We have a big scene in Montreal and Quebec, but it's really fragile, and we need to stay together and to work together, and what we can do in this kind of situation. So a lot of really great things happen, I think.
Thank you for that. A question to all of you which I asked already, does this virtual musical life that we now have, you know, that the way that you can only access the audience, or the only audience can only access you through the virtual channels for the most part, has this opened up new opportunities, new artistic and presentorial opportunities that were not there before? Maybe we can go in the inverse order and start with Miriam again.
Yes, I misunderstood a little bit what you asked, just about like the diffusion and the public, right?
Is there a new creative possibility in this situation for you?
Yeah, really.
Is there something, has something changed creatively?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, a lot of things. First, we I think because I work like almost all of my work happens in the like more electronic scene, audiovisual scene, and like festival like Tech and in the new music scene, we have still a big separation between like electroacoustic music, you know, and instrumental contemporary music. And since I would say like since September, they are more like a porosity between both, because I work a lot with musicians too, and since this year they need to include more digital stuff in their work, because they are like, oh, we need to do videos and maybe visuals and think about all the visual stuff that we can include on a scene, but we think more about that now because we do more audiovisual, like a tournage to present our work online. Or so yeah, I really like this aspect, because I think it changes mind just to think about, oh, we are musicians and we do like instrumental music, but we need to think about digital stuff and visual stuff and how we are presenting ourselves. So it in my case it opened a lot of new collaborations, and it's really great. Yeah.
Thank you. Gabrielle, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, I think that for sure there's new avenues that have opened up, but I say new with lots of precaution because it's not true. 17-year-olds do it, and they're we're using social media differently and with less judgment. I think there was lots of prejudice or like judgment on lots of ways of doing, because they were kind of deemed too commercial or too superficial or whatever. But like we're using the same tools now, and I think that there's we have to be mindful that we're not creating new formats and getting grants for it. Like, no, we really are not. These are apps and social media networks that are created by huge corporations, and they benefit from that, and we are using them kind of reluctantly a little bit, but also for many creative people, that's the way to do it. They do not have access to the funds we have, so that's very important to keep in mind, I think, because I think lots of us were very disappointed in opportunities that did not happen, but they were still like huge opportunities. Like similar to Miriam, like I was also supposed to do all that great, like, oh, I'm going to the Netherlands and they're paying, wow, you know. But so I just want to put that out there, that it's great to recognize like that we had a very like plush carpet to walk on before, and now it's being pulled from underneath. But there's many for many creative people that are sometimes not included to our roster of potential artists to program or to have in mind as curators, etc. Well, that's the reality, that there was less of a gap, yeah. Also, well, I thought that well, we had our vocal ensemble. I think you mentioned that I was a director, but it's a collective. I want to put that out there because it's very important if we're looking at the models of how people are getting together to do things. So that's an important distinction. But we did a project with a visual artist called Beth Frey, and for a long time, so she works a lot with apps and face swap and layers of watercolors and everything, and we had a project together, and there was a big question mark, like, how are we gonna do this live? You know, how is this gonna become a show? And then when we just decided, hey, this is research creation, and it just stays on the screen, and it's such an obvious solution, but it's great to be satisfied with the work living in a different way, and to accept that it's not necessarily always going to be that the end result of something isn't necessarily to be with an audience on a stage, etc., which has been a discussion for decades, of course, and but I think it's nice to kind of redefine what's a successful artistic process and result.
Thank you. That's very important. Redefining what is a successful artistic process is a really good statement that I would like to highlight at this point. And maybe a question to Barbara. You are representing and working with performing artists who also conform to the, let's call it the old model of having a repertoire and touring with this repertoire. So I read a tweet, I think by a London-based pianist, who suddenly said, after about a month of pandemic, I cannot play Beethoven anymore. I don't know how it's with you, but I cannot play Beethoven or Brahms or Schumann anymore because I'm just contributing to a digital world that has all this stuff in abundance. So what do I play? What is my new repertoire? And so maybe a question to you, to your artist: have they found new avenues for themselves in this time? And also for the presenters that you have to deal with, did they see this as a positive evolution in some ways, and in what ways? If you have maybe some examples.
Yeah. Well, I before I answer that, which is a really good question, I just want to say something about the state of technology as we wandered into the pandemic. The state of technology was such that, in a way, it was ready for us, right? As Gabrielle said, we, teenagers, 17-year-olds, 13-year-olds were already watching music on their iPhones. And in fact, in 2013, I was organizing a conference of the International Artist Managers Association here in Montreal. It was the first gathering outside of Europe of this organization. And I said, I think we really need a session called Watching Music. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, but that's what people do now. So for 100 years, we had Thomas Edison, we had the Victrola, we had recordings of just audio. But for the last 20 or so years, starting with pop music largely, we've had wonderful videos, not just of concerts, but videos of music, which are not just capturing a concert, but enhancing the concert. So you have, if you think about, the collaboration of Diaghilev and Stravinsky, for instance. I mean, you have choreographers who were working with composers in the early 20th century to create multidisciplinary, really collaborative projects. Well, in our time, and in fact, just before the lockdown, Myriam did a beautiful project with Collectif Neuf that was premiered in France with electronic music and arrangements of Beethoven and just absolutely gorgeous visual projections in a piece called Heroes. And unfortunately, because of the lockdown, we weren't able to do it again, but I know that there's conversation between the artistic director of Collectif Neuf and Myriam about how to bring this to, not just to the stage, but also into a film project. So I think what we're seeing is musicians and composers who already were thinking along these lines, really understanding the potential for creating multimedia projects and finding artistic collaborators with whom they feel comfortable. So that I just wanted to say that, and I think that as in all wars, technology tends to adapt to the stresses that appear in the society because of the war situation. And I think we're going to come out of this pandemic with a gift of technological know-how, which will improve things like time lapse in live streaming and people performing in Australia and Scandinavia at the same time, or Montreal and South Africa at the same time, collaborating so that we can actually have the live performance together without having, a 2-second lapse and it sounding awful. So your question though, I think some people really have stretched, and not just because there are a million recordings of Beethoven, but also I think a lot of things happened at the same time in this past year. The Black Lives Matter was incredibly important, and in fact, in some parts of the United States, people said, particularly in Alaska, for instance, people said it's not just Black Lives Matter, it's Indigenous Lives Matter. And so there's been in the United States, that sentiment, but I think that idea that there are voices that we have not heard from and that they're urgent and that we must listen to them. And so you have orchestras in Canada, which were dragging their feet and not presenting women composers, not presenting people of color, now contacting me and other agents or composers or Canadian Music Centre and saying, what have you got for me? I need something different. And that sense of needing something different is very important. You also have, because of the closed border situation, young performers getting an opportunity with orchestras that they wouldn't have in the past. So I've got, major orchestras saying, well, it's time for the unknown Canadian soloist to come and perform with us, because we're not going to bring somebody from Europe because we don't know if the border will be open and so on. So I think all of the people in the major institutions where the money tends to be concentrated are looking at stuff that they've never looked at before, not seriously, and understanding that the audience, which is what they need to answer to because they sell tickets, that audience, and they have donors, that audience is also understanding the urgency of now, as we say, that fierce urgency of now, that we need to listen to where the world is at right now. So nothing is perfect, but I really do see that this huge shift, there's a kind of a tsunami of change happening. And if we don't ride the wave, we're going to miss a great opportunity. So does that answer your question? Maybe a little.
Thank you. Yes, in many directions. And I would invite the other panelists who are listening in, I believe, if they want to say something, please say so. And maybe Vanessa, are there any questions from the audience that are pertinent to what we're talking about?
Only one from Brandon.
Okay.
But yeah, we can take it. Brandon, do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. I can perhaps just read it. I think it also connects to what you were saying, Barbara, just now about, wanting to meet audiences where they at, and this concept of watching music and not just listening to it. It just keeps on making me think that this digital turn means that we have this kind of new working relationship with often these large American internet companies like Google and now Zoom, all these sort of things. So I guess my question is, like, how do you see this in relation to our formerly very independent forms of art making, or independent also in the sense where the mediation, maybe in a very literal sense, and that the mediation between the audience and the musicians wasn't mediated by an American tech company, for example. You could look at other forms of oppression and all these things, but for example, in this conversation, I just looked, we're being routed through a data center in the US for this conversation, so like already we're like so entangled in these geopolitical webs of technology and infrastructure that we're barely able to untangle ourselves from them. So I wonder sort of how we negotiate between, both adapting to how audiences want to consume content, but at the same time, recognizing that, we need to question also these power relations and not just take them for granted, also articulate forms of resistance so that we're not just sort of seeing the digital turn as, that we are just wholeheartedly embracing the attention economy of the online, of online platforms, and then being sort of just more fodder for Netflix or something like this.
I want to say, one of the things that's very problematic in the digital turn is the expense of doing a production. It is hugely expensive, and the resources are not obvious. If everybody who ever did a concert in a hall suddenly needed to find the money to produce a film, they would be hard pressed. We'd run out of money, or donors or something. However, the fact is that there's opportunity for great artistic collaboration, and people like Miriam, for instance, and fields like chamber opera are really coming to the fore. That idea of a kind of a theatrical dimension to performance. And how do we deal with the GAFA, the AGFA, the Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Google, Facebook, that monstrous new phase of capitalism? How do we deal with that is quite problematic. Again, I think in Canada we've been very fortunate to have some people step up to the plate, like Trisha Baldwin at Queen's University, who's just really offered her venue with cameras and she's bought good quality cameras and mics to do some concert recording. And also the Ottawa Chamber Music Society has been doing these wonderful chamber music chats with people from, string quartets to the two-spirited Indigenous composer Chris Dirksen. And so in a way, it's been an opportunity. This is providing an opportunity, and because of the presence on the web, for voices that had not been known before to come to the fore on an equal footing with people who've been there for decades, your traditional string quartet. I'm not sure I know the answer to how do we not become fodder so that somebody can advertise on the YouTube channel of of an experimental video artist. I'm not sure I have the solution to that, but I do believe, and people will disagree with me, that if you don't go to the public square, you won't be in the public eye. And I do think it's important to be there, to have a say, and to ask all the right questions even as you step out into that public square. I'm reading The Age of Surveillance Surveillance Capitalism right now, and it's full of questions for me. Shoshana Zuboff's book. I don't know where the answer is, but I'm not sure that the answer is not participating. I think being front and center in the world and saying we're not going to leave this public square to nonsense. We have things to say and we want to say it.
Yeah, this whole question of the change of the public, the general public and the public eye in the arts that has been very contested in discussions about the pandemic too. But before I go on, maybe Miriam or Gabrielle, you have a comment on the Google alphabet question. Zoom, you're on Zoom now.
By the way, we have a question also by Adele.
Ah, yes. maybe just, if there's no comment for that question, maybe we can go to Adele's question. Or does anyone, Gabriel or Miriam, do you want to say something?
Well, I think the conclusion that Barbara put out is kind of in the same lines of what I was going to say. Like we have to compromise always in some way, and there's maybe going to be new ways to do this so that these huge billionaire whatever companies don't profit from what we're doing. But I think it's total disengagement is also maybe not what we should be looking at in this present moment. The same way that half of us today are not speaking our tongue to communicate, to share ideas, and that it's putting a light on, you know, the fact that English is our lingua franca. Well, Google is kind of the equivalent in terms of, you know, there's things that are kind of, and I mean, I think there's ways to, we're still not in an age of censorship where I can be on Zoom and say fuck Zoom. So we can still be kind of critical of and mindful and bring out these contradictions in how we engage with things, if that makes sense.
There's this question also to me of power, of course. Does the power get shifted? I mean, in the, let's always call it the old world or something, the pre-COVID world, power was distributed, but it was very strongly oriented towards persons who held powerful positions, who were the gatekeepers. Terry was talking about this, gatekeeper institutions, gatekeeper foundations. It seems to me a little as if that power has been transformed a little bit. And I don't know how to say it yet, but these gatekeepers are not as powerful as they were before. It's something that Brandon also mentioned with the opera houses crumbling a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with that in the sense that the way the question was even asked was like, we were used to very independent forms of art making. Well, they aren't completely in a vacuum of independence. Like we were still negotiating with some sort of power, as you say. So I think it's just the things are kind of shifting, and we as artists, we're kind of finding our place in these different realities.
Adele had a question. Do you want to ask it?
Sure. It's directly taken from a discussion in the publication, where I address this notion of basically meaningfulness in sharing content, musical content online. Yeah, I would like to ask you, especially the two of you performers, like have you seen examples of live streams or something similar, and that you feel have transmitted some of this meaningfulness that you would, that would kind of continue drawing you back to the concert halls or the clubs or whatever, just trying to put technology against the wall and demanding more from it, and perhaps also demanding more from event hosts coming up with new creative ways of actually keeping the meaningfulness in new music events.
Miriam, maybe do you have something to that?
Yes, I think that we need like to be able like to maybe to survive or to have a place in the big world of digital content. We need to rethink about how we want to present our work. It's not just a visual thing, it's all like, because like the format that we present a show without any public, and it's just like one camera, that's it. I don't think that it can survive on the web. We need to rethink about what is the place of the musicians and the way that they work and what they think and how they want to present the piece or the music to the public by maybe take the parole and talk about their work and maybe like I'm working on a thing like at the Université of Montreal, and it's beautiful because they present the work of the orchestra at the university, but not just like we present the piece like that, but we film behind the scene with everybody that work on the scene and during the practice, and the musician can talk. And I think the public really love that because you get closer to the artist and you can understand what is going on. So I think we need to maybe to getting closer to the public by showing something else than just awesome musicians on stage that you can't approach and you can't talk to the composer, and often you even see the composer and you don't know who is it. And so I think maybe we need to think about those things.
For me, meaningfulness is a word I quite like, and it's a word that is deeply in resonance with audience. So what's meaningful to some audience members might not be meaningful to others. So in that sense, I think the work we put out as artists, like if it's meaningful in a way that it's that I don't know how to explain this, but I totally agree with what Myriam is saying in terms of a kind of the level of like how things can stand out in the sea of virtual content. So we need to think of these questions. So I agree with that, but there's a flip side to me, which is I could be very compelled by something very simple. That's a person with a webcam, but maybe what they have to say and do is going to be very meaningful to me. And when I say that, I'm thinking of micro communities and not necessarily this idea that there's a general audience. There's the idea that something can really be impactful for a type of audience, whether we're basing it on generation or the network that they're in, or their identities, or all these different factors key in. So I think that for me, meaningfulness is really in dialogue with like who am I, who do I want to engage with this work. And in some cases, the way and the medium and all these questions that Myriam put forth are super important to consider. And sometimes they might not be, and that's good. I feel I think that's a good thing to keep in mind a little bit.
I would like to pick up on the word micro communities, because in many ways, new music is such a micro community already. And much smaller than many other things that are called micro communities. I don't know, the K-pop fans are much larger community now than new music fans, I'm sure. And it's still called a micro community. And so we have this situation in a pre-digital world. There were some micro communities that were much more visible and much more invested in the structure of cultural discourse. And I can hear from what all of you are saying that there seems to be a shift in that, and that the advantage of state support doesn't really help in this other realm. Not so much, at least. But still, there's still a question about, and this is a panel about diversity and how it evolves. And I would like to get, in the second half of this conversation, get maybe back on that topic too. There's a question by Terry. Terry, would you like to ask it yourself, or should I just read it out, or Vanessa could read it out?
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for the comments, Miriam, Gabrielle, and Barbara. My question relates a little bit to some of the comments before about new initiatives that are happening with orchestras or more traditional institutions and how they're bringing in Indigenous artists. It seems to me, I mean, I'm extremely happy that these are happening. Sometimes, however, I do get struck by the fact that it's the same handful of artists that seem to be always solicited, and I am trying to become increasingly aware of how many artists are out there, and certainly more than a handful. And I am also struck, for example, when an orchestra is commissions a work by one of these composers, that the orchestra members, that there are no Indigenous artists, or at least not visibly Indigenous artists among them. And I'm wondering, what are they doing on this much more deep level of who's getting those positions with full salaries and so on. And I understand that this is all tied up also in the question of donors, because I'm sure that they have a lot of power, and I'm wondering how much are we pushing them to educate the donors about what might be a more fair and just way of doing things. And so I'm just wondering about that, about how we're in what way are we keeping promoting the same thing while superficially making a difference? And how do we get past that to really, do we have to just say no more orchestras, or is there a way to make an orchestra less uniform? So I'm just wondering whether anybody has any ideas about that, because I feel quite hopeless often about these big institutions and whether they can even change. Thanks.
I'd be happy to address the question to some degree, at least. I mean, it is clear that institutional change is generally very slow. One of the things that is, of course, being discussed is changing board membership, donors, and this changes as society changes to some degree. If if an orchestra needs people who can contribute $25,000 for a new project, well, how many people from marginal communities are in that position? On the other hand, if you don't have somebody on your board as an orchestra or an opera company who can at least be a conscience for these questions, then you may never even think about it. You may not look for the person from a minority who has done very well. I mean, there are minority people who have been funding the major museums in Toronto for decades now, and that's extremely important and valuable for those institutions. Canada Council has an Indigenous person as the chairman of the board now. This is it tokenism? Would it be horrible if there weren't that initiative? I don't know. I mean, I don't know what realistically this will change, but I think it suggests that there is a will institutionally at Canada Council, and it's not the only evidence of it, to really look at other voices. So, as far as work being done at orchestras or in opera companies, the Opéra de Montréal has really started some wonderful programs with series outside of the opera house, but in secondary halls, but really great opportunities for new work to be developed, as have other small opera companies across Canada. And there's a wonderful company called Musique Trois Femmes that's been started by 3 women. Jennifer Sito is one of the leaders of this, and she's extremely respected in the opera community. And I think her energy and her ideas will make huge shifts across Canada and in other parts of the world because of her attention and her knowledge as an engaged artist. So again, if you're not engaged, people may not be able to find a way to pay attention. So I applaud the initiatives, even if at times they may look like tokens. And if you're not there in the first place, you can't be rediscovered, as we found with many African American composers in the United States who were totally marginalized, but are now at least being rediscovered. So we do our best.
Brandon had raised a hand.
Yeah. Oops. There we go. Yeah, I mean, just picking up on this question from Terry, I think it goes back to what I maybe unsuccessfully was trying to encapsulate in the previous discussion in response to Barbara's question. And I'll try sort of another stab at it here. In that, the framework of the question and also of a little bit also of your response, Barbara, is that we're very focused on this kind of orchestral framework or perhaps also an opera framework. And I think I would want to sort of also kind of ask what it's like to consider diversity perhaps in the perspective of moving away from only focusing on the programming of orchestras to also being programming, for example, your ensemble, Gabrielle, in the same hall, or a production of yours, Miriam, in the same hall, not adapting it, just, making those resources available and then, just letting it happen. And I wonder also if that's sort of speaking to, I mean, maybe from my position of ignorance of the Canadian scene, is this just sort of the kind of multicultural format that's sort of at work there, or is this, are we only talking about composers here and we're leaving sort of other communities to sort of work on their own issues, or how does this also relate to issues of perhaps new music being a micro community, as we were just talking about earlier? I think there's a lot of sort of important definitional questions here that actually end up really being very central to this entire debate.
Yeah, there's this big question about the classical mainstream institutions. There's also a question in the stream. I will cite that. I just see that it seems that Indigenous artists have first to win a Polaris Prize or work with Björk before any mainstream Canadian classical institution will consider them as viable, marketable performers. We all know who that is talking about. So is that all the question? I mean, there's always this, I mean, coming from marginalized communities, from colonialized peoples, from there's always this desire to be accepted by the big institutions as they are before you enter them. So not by a changed, broken up, powerless institution, and then you can enter, but to be recognized by the same powers that also recognized other people who are, more visible and who are more in the framework of these institutions. So that's one desire, and the other desire obviously is to break them up and to make them more open and flexible. And I think these two desires conflict with each other often. I can see that in my own reaction to some things. Sometimes, you have the desire to be accepted by through the same mechanisms that everybody else is accepted. But sometimes you want to be a factor in opening these institutions up and making them much more malleable, and both artistically and economically and in programming ways. So I think there's a real question of where the desires lie. Maybe those people who run those institutions for many years see the need to change them, but sometimes there's also this, for a writer from the colonies, it was very hugely important to win the Booker Prize, not an international Booker Prize, or not a Booker Prize for women or Booker Prize for Indigenous writers, just the Booker Prize as it was in the same power structure. So there are all these kind of different things that come into this realm. I would go from there. We're talking about institutions. to a question that was already on our brief when we were invited to this panel. I think Brandon asked it of all of us. And it's the question of the bottleneck effect. So we're now turning ourselves to the future a little bit. The immediate future, not the far future, which will come maybe at the end of the discussion, the immediate future. So when and as institutions open again, there's certain to be a kind of bottleneck effect in the sense that things have backed up. There's so many productions in the pipeline now that can all get out. What kind of effect will that have on smaller, more fragile, more precarious producers who may get lost in the tumble, in this huge race to be open again and to show all the work that you have done during these years? How do you see that, and how does it affect, especially because we're talking about precarious and marginalized communities and these precarious producers who don't have the means at hand to stage large media campaigns to promote their own work, and so on. So how do you see that happening? What would be a recommendation that you think would be useful? Does anyone want to take that?
Sure. I'm also like burning to say stuff about what was just said. I'll just say two things, but they kind of will tie into the answer to this. I think at some point, like we have to give up power, and I say we in a weird sense because I'm not on the board of a orchestra, but we can't just expect that change will happen without some sort of like a diminishing of resources or diminishing of something of power. Also, we're in new music. Like, we don't need to care about the orchestra. We really don't. There's so many other ways, and we all navigate it. I don't know the work of every artist that came, but we've just mentioned that, yes, there's sometimes collaborations, and we want to, between changing the scene from within and doing other stuff, there's tons of gray areas. But I guess where I'm going with that is that for this bottleneck thing, and I think that it always goes back to me to this idea of the micro versus the macro, and I'm just looking forward to not necessarily having institutions or organizations that have these broad names or definitions. The Canadian Music Center is not the Canadian Music Center. Like those names, or the Canadian League of Composers. Yeah, I guess it is, but so there. We have to. I don't know why there's so much effort on widening and being inclusive when the roots of stuff are so biased. So I'm just so much more interested in what's coming from what's being born out of what we're living right now, that might not have that might not define itself as wanting into all these things. Also, but so that's one thing. If I go less radical, not that was that radical, but there's I've seen cool things happen. One is the title of disruptor in residence at the Canadian Opera Company, where Amplified Opera was named artistic disruptor in residence or something like that. That's interesting because it's at some point it will have to be about disruption and about shaking things up and about like really challenging the people that give the opportunities, because they are opportunities, but they come with like a lot of they're not always. So I don't have solutions. I just know that I'm more interested in keeping the pulse on what's emerging and what has new definitions, and that because we're talking about diversity and plurality, and I when we try to group things, for me there's something that doesn't work. So I want to see diversity, but from another side, not from the side of like hunger from more from a sense of sprouting and wanting to live and to create, and that. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of answers it, but for sure yeah, that's what I have to say.
Really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there enough place to sprout though? That's I think that was the question
bottleneck.
a little. That's the bottleneck. Will there be enough place to sprout?
Yeah, well, I think that the spaces can be. I mean, when I say I'm interested in seeing what people come up, I'm also interested in the new spaces that can arise, spaces that that are existing or that I'm unaware of, or that because there's creative people out there and they're not just standing alone in their apartment. They're doing stuff. It's sometimes tougher to discover, but I'd rather sort of. I don't know if I was a donor. I can't right now, but I would want to support that kind of thing. So I would wish that that happened. But yeah, I don't have the solutions, unfortunately.
I think if I can just jump in for a second, or quickly at least, there's I think we're seeing when there's a bottleneck. Those sprouters find a way to get through the cracks, and whether it's house concerts or galleries or unusual spaces, or and I have been in touch with the Canadian Association of Museums about how they can perhaps open up to more performance-related activities in their venues, and also with a number of universities. There are always problems dealing with institutions because of legal questions, security questions, labor unions, maybe stage hands, whatever these things might be, insurance issues. But the good old house concert is also, I've used my living room to have non-piano based music of all cultures performed there. And also, I think it's, again, going back to that idea of taking a breather, it can still be time to articulate in other ways, to reflect on, to increase the level of discourse about the work we do. I've often puzzled at why, for instance, great, movements in 20th century music took hold. And I think to some degree, it was because people had an intellectual framework within which they could talk about it, whether it was at an intellectual level, an academic level, or just a social level. And so movements like minimalism had a real opportunity, and it started in galleries or in lofts or in people's living rooms, but it had a real opportunity to flourish because there was a discourse that developed around it. And I think perhaps we don't do enough of that with any kind of new music, whether it's new music of aesthetic focus or cultural diversity or pluralistic focus. I think we need to really find ways to talk about it, which is not, oh, I really loved that, or I really hated that, but to bring to light some of the features of it that touch us as human beings, like whether it's the energy or the peacefulness or whatever it is, so that we can share the meaningfulness, to come back to that question, with people who are also not necessarily engaged in the milieu, but who have ears and hearts and brains like the rest of us, and want to know they're curious enough to want to know what is coming out of the artists of our time. We need a better way of talking about it, and not just ourselves ourselves, yourselves as artists, but the community, the critical thinking community, the fan base community. We can work on
We need
that.
fan fiction, so to speak.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to orient the gaze a little further into the future. And that's another question that is on our brief for this symposium. It's a question about touring. I've been thinking a lot about touring myself. I mean, you know, my life is very nomadic. And there was a movement even before the pandemic, about 2-3 years before the pandemic, a movement started that related with the Fridays for Future and other movements where flying was becoming problematic. And arts institutions in Europe quickly reacted to ask artists to travel by train if they could, and so on, which is not possible in transcontinental questions. But in this situation of looking at diversity and the focus on indigeneity, another aspect of that comes through too, that in some way one could say that flying around to present your work elsewhere is part of a settler mentality, of a conqueror mentality, so to speak. One could classify it at that. Now, at the moment, no one is flying, or very few people are flying. It will change again. That will come back in some way, not at the same extent probably, and most likely more expensive ways of traveling. But how do you see this whole question, this whole complex of touring after the pandemic? Is it an opportunity? Is it not? I mean, sure, it's a loss in visibility in some sense, but what does it mean to not tour as much as before? And Miriam, you said that you felt the first half year certainly as a kind of relief or a moment to step back. After a year now, and possibly another half year, or maybe in a full year, depending on what happens with all the mutations of the viruses. What do you think about this question of not being able to tour, or afterwards, when you are able to tour, will something change in your behavior? What is your thought on that?
This is a really, really complex question. I ask myself a lot about that. I think it's really complex because sure, we like to tour. For me, it's really a way to meet people, to meet public, to meet different kinds of thinking. It's what I like about meet other people and artists from other countries. After a few years, maybe because I tour mostly in Europe, but I began to be a little bit shocked about the manque de diversité finally in a lot of festivals. I was always watching the same things, the same performances, the same people, and a lot of people from Montreal. I was always with them, you know. So it was like, oh, I like to meet new people and meet new way of thinking, but finally I'm always with the same people. So what's the point? So it's like une chose bizarre for me to think about that. And finally, I was thinking, about that during the last year, and I find that because we are talking about diversity, I find that we need first, as an artist, to find it inside ourselves. As an artist, like to think about, not to think about how I can fit in a box to play at this festival and this festival, because when you travel, you see that festivals are really like have really this aesthetic and this thing. So if I want to tour in this big circuit, I need to fit in, you know. So like now we we are not thinking about touring and festivals. So we don't need to think if we fit into this thing. You know, you can do whatever you want and just present it on YouTube. I don't know, because you have not this line for your year to think about the tour. So it's really nice to think about that. I think, and the second thing is, if I can do whatever I want, I can do it with new people. So because the people that I knew are like are the people who is in my scene are no really, because we don't see each other. You know, I don't go to the pub. I don't. It's all on internet, like we chat. So last year I met a lot of new people from scene in Montreal. That it was like, you know, it's really nice to see, like, okay, I was in Europe and in I don't know where, but there are a lot of diversity here in Montreal, and now I can see it. And yeah, I don't know if I answered the question. It's a lot of things, but you know, yeah, it's what I feel about that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the local communities get reevaluated. There is a lot of diversity everywhere we go. That's a consequence of the, you know, colonial and post-colonial histories that all our planet has. And Gabriel and yeah, refugees, part of that movement too. Gabriel and me have been engaged in some of such projects exploring local connections in a local community. Gabriel, is there anything that you want to say about the touring question?
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Miriam. There's lots of these conflicting thoughts also for me, lots of what you say. I think that I'm going back to resources a little bit. I think I really believe in funding bodies and the council and the changes, and I'm pretty positive about and hopeful about that. I'm not there's still room to grow, but you know, they blocked all funding for travel, responsibly so. And does that mean, like, is there more money to share for subsisting, or more? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm curious. I haven't seen the statistics, but like, you know, maybe pushing successful, active artists to be like stars. It feels, it's fun, but like it has consequences on the community, on the larger community of artists. So I'm thinking a lot about that, like what like all these resources. There's lots of like, I mean, there's little money. I think there could be more money for the arts, and less for, I don't know, like planes that kill people, things like that. But I do think that there's still lots of resources, and if the cultural sector has proven things over many years is our resourcefulness, but I don't think there's the same level of resourcefulness at all levels of funded. You know, like I think there's, you know, you could take the flower budget probably for Montreal Symphony Orchestra can make like 3 people live probably for like 3 years. I don't know. So I'm seeing it like that. So maybe travel, I don't think it should be out of. I mean, I still think there's so much to do about international connection, and networking and sharing of ideas and of practices. But I think we're all seeing it a little bit under a new light, and where our perspectives are maybe changing. So I definitely see how I'm not as eager to go tour as I used to be, and and something that we have to to seek is like maybe that sense of success. Also, I've talked about redefining the standards of success, but in terms of like maybe we don't need that fancy festival in Europe to tell us we're good. Maybe our own audiences here or through virtual means can do that too. Can provide that little ego boost of like, I'm doing good work, you know. It can come from the local scale.
No, that's great. I'm just a little skeptical because we all know this situation that the prophet in their own country has a much harder time than when they get approbation from somewhere else. So you have to go away to get the approbation at home or the recognition at home. So I don't know, this seems to be a human constant in lives, because it's a very old saying, and it has accompanied humans throughout their career on this planet, that you're not always recognized by the same people that you grew up with. So that's one question that maybe plays in that. But Barbara, you had another point?
I just, it's kind of administrative logistical point. Really two things. One is that I do think that it's very important to encourage artists who have new projects, to see if we can find co-producing or co-commissioning entities from different parts of Canada. I mean, people in Vancouver haven't really got much of a clue what's going on in Halifax, or people in Alberta about what's going on in Montreal. And we really need to take, especially now that we're not traveling, take the time, find the way to learn about the extraordinary artists who are around here, so that we can find resources to co-commission to a greater extent works by some of the wonderful artists who will need more money, more support going forward, so that those works are not, they're not orphaned. They don't have a one performance and then they die kind of existence. And then the other thing is to really get rid of this exclusivity clause. I don't know if the world knows this nasty secret about the performing arts world. Most venues in Europe and in North America have exclusivity clauses, and they say you cannot perform within a certain amount of miles of this venue while you're coming to see us, which means that you have to get on a plane and go very far away to do your next performance. And what that does is it depletes the energy and the resources of the artist without really using and exploring the wealth of richness that that artist may have to offer, in terms of maybe a second program that they can do in a nearby town, or something at a lunchtime concert. Polini used to do lunchtime concerts at the Fiat factories. So in Turin. So, I mean, I think we have ways of really understanding and using that terrible word, using the resources of the artist. Well, understanding the richness that an artist has to offer as a neighbor, as a friend, as a colleague, and really explore what it means to have a residency every time you go out, so that you're exploring, sharing, teaching, talking, meeting 5-year-olds and meeting 75-year-olds and people who maybe can't get to the performance, but you can do something else with them because you're a multifaceted human being.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Well, we're nearing the end of our meeting time. I have one last round, and it's a kind of a science fiction question. So in 10 years' time, a short vision of what the musical scene would be like in terms of diversity, touring, creativity, micro-communities, all the terms. What do you think will happen? Or will it just bounce back to the old thing and the forces of conservatism will win? What do you think? Maybe each of you in a short statement.
Pendulums
Yeah.
always swing. We'll go 2 steps forward and 1 step back, I suspect. But I think if we understand what the forces that keep a vision of forward motion going, curiosity, creativity, cultivating people's capabilities. I mean, there's a wonderful movement that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have really developed in philosophy and society and economy, but it really applies to the arts as well, the cultivating capabilities, this idea of, and it's not just the professional artist, but anybody who allows the art to speak to them, to allow the music to find you, and find a way to express it, whether you're a professional or not, and let that really be part of what makes the world go forward. And we need to cultivate and allow room for that. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for heaven's sakes. That must make it really true, right? Yeah.
Human musical rights.
Yeah.
Miriam, do you have any thought about 10 years in the future?
I think for me, I like right now, I'm really in this mood, like to reconnect with the people who are around me, close to me, but that I didn't see before, you know. So to think about what is happening there, just the other side of the street, and I find a lot of beautiful things and a lot of diversity, you know, that I didn't see before, because I was like, whoa, in the Europe or in my project, I don't know. And for me, the future is that, like, talk to your neighborhood, you know, and try to do something with them.
Gabrielle?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a prediction or a wish. It's maybe more of a wish, but I guess that the art scene is concerned with I liked the sustainability of the artist point that Barbara made earlier on. So that maybe not just high functioning white male and an and or in there. That not only that success could and actually making a living from art can be more even, can be less about we didn't talk a lot about mental health, but that's a big thing I'm thinking about. And I mean, I think that lots of who we're seeing doing all these things and being active and touring are highly functioning people. And it's not like that. It's not like that for everyone. And there's so many artists that are a bit lost in that competitive kind of nature of getting those funds and getting that piece of the pie. So I'm hoping for more of an even spread and lots of quality in what we're going to see as well.
Thank you all for this wonderfully engaged and diverse conversation. There will be another panel this afternoon. Brandon, do you want to say something about it?
About the second part this afternoon?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, you can find all the information on the SMCQ website. And yeah, we encourage you to sort of continue the conversation there for our viewers on YouTube, and also for all of the panelists to also attend. And sort of bring also the ideas about diversity onto the next part of the day. But I think I would also take that opportunity, first of all, to thank you, Sandeep, for your moderation of the second part of the day. That was really wonderful. And also, all of the panelists for your really interesting ideas in both parts of our session today. And once again, I think I would also like to thank the SMCQ for hosting us, and to Gabrielle Couillard for helping us with the tech of this Zoom session. Yeah, so I think we could probably leave it there. And I know we had sort of a lot of ideas, maybe more ideas than we had time to really explore in detail, but I hope that this will be a ongoing conversation that we can continue to unfold, sort of as Barbara was hinting at, that this whole idea of diversity, I think, is really one where there's certain amounts of different sort of narratives or sort of contested spaces that are opening up that I think are very healthy for our field going forward, to really start to grapple in a fundamental way with these issues, and really not to let them slide into the background as we rethink and restart the performing arts after COVID. So thank you very much to everyone. Maybe I should also plug our book. I'm getting the message here once more. Taking the Temperature is available on oncurating.org. I believe the link should be in the in the YouTube chat, as well as in the chat here in the Zoom. Yes, and you're all involved, so I encourage to spread it into your networks. I think that would be everything, unless there's very, very urgent messages from the panelists. Oh, no, sure, Barbara.
There's a message from Terry in the chat, which is about resounding the orchestra report that Orchestras Canada, now called Association of Orchestras of Canada, AOC, put out, and it's well worth looking at. Orchestras Canada has really made some significant steps in exploring diversity and bringing Dylan Robinson. That's
wonderful. Yeah, I've just clicked on the link. Thank you, and we'll also make a note to save this chat and share that with everyone afterwards. Definitely, I think also this aspect of pooling resources and not redoing work in this diversity space are very important, because I often see that we ask the same questions in different contexts and not really connect to the different initiatives that are already sort of ongoing in various spaces. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you in the next session.